Caleb asked me to speak about women in China because I'm the person who's always saying, well, it may seem like we've been under patriarchal restrictions on women for 2,000, no, make that 4,000, no, make that 5,000 years, yes, but for 10 or 20,000 years before that, that's not the way it was, and we always have to remember that. And we, women were powerful for many, many more years than we have lived under oppressive society, and we have to keep that as part of our consciousness at all times. Unfortunately, I don't have as much specific information about China in that regard. But we'll talk about ancient China and coming up to revolutionary China, which has had actually a whole lot of different periods in it. And Caleb, I'm sure, will make a lot of that even clearer. It's a lot to cover. Before I get started, I want to sound some cautionary notes. Because whenever we start talking about China, we're in the midst of these cross currents where China has been a favorite topic for bashing in recent years. And so if you just so much as Google a topic related to China, you have to immediately ask yourself, who is writing this article and what perspective are they writing it from? And why would they choose to be, do they have an interest in slanting the information that they're presenting from this perspective? And particularly if we get up to revolutionary China, socialist China, are they even able to understand? Are they socialists? Are they capable of understanding socialist China? It's a big consideration. So also you have to really be keeping track of what is the class position of the women they're describing. The conditions that the women are living under make a huge difference, obviously. Whether it's upper class women, even within the upper class households, there were many different levels of the way women lived, or the peasants, and within the peasants, the feudal society in China lasts for many thousands of years. But even within peasant society, there was a whole gradation from what was considered prosperous to desperately poor, really on the verge of starvation. And then, as you get towards the modern era, you have to think about, are we talking about women in an urban environment, or are we talking about the countryside? Because all of that makes a huge difference in what the conditions are for women. And you really even can't talk about what the attitudes are without talking about the basic nitty-gritty conditions, because that will determine, in large part, what women's consciousness are. That's actually a Marxist concept. It's incredibly helpful, is that material conditions at least have a basis of determining consciousness. In large part, they frequently determine consciousness. Anyway, so as I mentioned, today we're not going to do prehistory in China. Maybe at some point we'll want to do a whole session on prehistory in many parts of the world, but we'll leave that to another session. But as I mentioned, refer to China is a very ancient society, so ancient that it's hard for us to even imagine how many millennia its history covered, how many different dynasties, and I'll give you one example. In this country, we tend to think of China, foot binding, China, foot binding. Well, in fact, foot binding was introduced relatively recently, I say relatively, around 937 AD in the Southern Tang Dynasty. And I'm sure that's not pronounced correctly, so if somebody can correct my pronunciation. But it did not exist always. It was a horrible cultural practice that was introduced over 1,000 years ago. But let's talk about foot binding a little bit. You probably know that the feet were bent over, starting when girls were really quite young. The original emperor had this lotus that he fashioned, and he had a maiden. He had her bind her feet with a silk cloth and had her dance on this lotus, and that was the origin of the binding of the feet. And the other court dancers then ended up being ordered to bind their feet, and that was the origin of this custom. It made walking extremely difficult, virtually impossible, and it was extremely painful. So it really put young women and older women through agonies. And this was largely practiced by women of the upper classes, but amazingly, not exclusively. Even among the peasant classes, there was some foot binding. But obviously for the women, the peasant women who were working in the fields, it was modified and even not practiced. And, that is a positive. Now, the whole issue of foot binding gives us a chance to take a step back and say, are we going to just cast a judgment on China for this practice that was oppressive towards women? Is there anything, perhaps, in our society that might even resemble foot binding or have a counterpart to foot binding? I have made up a term that I call cultural foot binding, and I'm not even referring necessarily to stiletto. Sometimes it's a frame of mind. And I will bring it close to home. One of my daughters said to me one time, women have to suffer for beauty. Really? Well, obviously she didn't learn that from me. So that's part of it. It's imbued in our society. Women have to suffer for beauty. Let's just think about that. We'll just put that in the back of our minds. Okay? In the feudal society, and throughout all the different classes in the feudal society, women were in fact second and third class citizens, and the young wives were beaten by their husbands and their mothers-in-law. The tiny grain of power that you could aspire to as a woman was to rise through age and become a mother-in-law, so you could beat your daughter-in-law. How perverse is that? Of course, other family members could beat the young wives as well. And as part of the household, there were concubines.